Imagine an ordinary day in a bustling city. At an intersection, under the dim light of a street lamp, a patrol car stops. A policeman gets out of it and stares coldly at a young black girl who is just going about her business. She has no idea that in just a few minutes, her life will be threatened, a threat she didn't even know was coming. This cop has it all figured out. He wants to accuse her of a crime she didn't commit, frame her, erase her innocence under the weight of false accusations. He doesn't even realize he's being watched. Now stop for a second. Think, how often do these situations go unnoticed? How often do people suffer because of injustice when no one sees the truth? But today the story takes a different turn, and we'll tell you how a tiny surveillance camera became an invisible witness that could change everything. Let us know in the comments what your name is and where you're watching this video from. It's incredibly important for us to know you're with us. Your support helps us make these videos and fight for the truth. Each of your names, each of your messages brings us closer to making sure these stories are heard around the world. Thank you for being you. You inspire us to make our channel stronger and more important to everyone. We appreciate each and every one of you immensely. The day began like many others, a quiet and familiar morning in a small bedroom community in the city. Leah, a black teenage girl, woke up with the first rays of sunlight coming through the thick curtains of her small room. Her family had lived here for years, and the streets, the houses, even the cracks in the pavement seemed so familiar, as if every corner held a piece of her childhood. She got up, dressed quickly, put on her favorite sports jacket, which was a little big but made her feel cozy, and went to the kitchen, where the aroma of hot coffee and breakfast, prepared by her grandmother, was waiting for her. It was fresh outside, and the morning air was invigorating, promising a sunny day. Leah walked down the narrow street to school, occasionally greeting the neighbors who had known her since she was a little girl. On the way she met Maria, her friend, and they chatted cheerfully about the day ahead, planning to stop by their favorite cafe after school to chat and share news. Everything seemed normal today, and her thoughts were occupied with the usual teenage worries: her studies, her friends, and maybe the boy she'd recently met. On the way, Leah stopped at the local grocery store to buy some snacks for lunch. Al Clark, a kind, middle-aged woman named Mrs. Jenkins, was always friendly, and they had a few words. On the way out, Leah noticed a police car parked in front of a neighboring house, but she didn't think much of it. The neighborhood was relatively quiet, and the cops were usually just patrolling the streets. Everything went on as usual. The city was waking up. Residents were hurrying to work. Mothers were taking their children to the school buses, and Leah was walking her way, catching the warm light and the light breeze that ruffled her hair. Her day was supposed to be the same as it always was, and there was not a shadow of a thought in her mind that things could go differently. But she didn't yet know that this ordinary day was a harbinger of the disturbing events that would begin to unfold when the peaceful picture of her life was suddenly shattered. As Leah approached the intersection on her way to school, an unusual silence caught her attention. The streets were usually busy at this time: children walking to school, adults rushing to work, cars stopped at red lights, and the sounds of street noise blending into a background hum. But now it seemed as if everything was frozen, as if waiting. The police car stood a little farther back on the curb, its massive silhouette standing out against the bright morning light. At first Leah thought they were just on duty or talking on the radio, but as soon as she crossed the street, a policeman stepped out of the car, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered and chiseled by years of service. He stared at her with an impenetrable expression. His eyes were cold, and there was an almost silent sternness in that gaze, an undercurrent of dislike that Leah couldn't understand. She slowed her step a little, instinctively feeling his gaze. He was standing beside the car, his hands at his waist, his fingers lightly touching the police belt. Nothing in his posture suggested hostility, but there was something unsettling in the way he was looking at her. Subtle, as if he already saw her as a suspect. Leah felt her heart beat faster. She wanted to look away, but something held her back, like an invisible force. "Hey, you!" the policeman shouted. His voice, rough and demanding, cut through the silence. Leah frowned. She'd always been taught to respect the police, not to ask questions and to be calm, but now she felt a chill run through her body. She glanced at him, trying to appear confident, though something inside her trembled. The policeman stepped toward her and then stopped at a distance, staring at her intently. "What are you doing here so early?" His question sounded like he was catching her in the act, even though she was only on her way to school. "Going to class, sir," she replied quietly, not realizing what was wrong. He squinted, as if assessing her words, and frowned, as if expecting a catch. The look pierced her to the core. It wasn't just a question. It was suspicion. His eyes glittered with cold wariness, and she felt like she was cornered. It seemed to her that he saw something in her that wasn't there, that he decided something about her beforehand. Leah tried not to look the policeman in the eye, seeking relief in movement. She took a step to the side, but he stepped forward, blocking her path. "Are you a local?" he asked, with a touch of skepticism. "Yes, sir. I live here with my family," she answered, feeling a wave of discomfort run through her body. The question seemed too personal, too suspicious, like it was testing her. No policeman had ever stopped her for nothing before. He nodded, but there was no satisfaction in his face, as if her answers had increased his distrust rather than decreased it. He stared after her as she took another step, then another, feeling his gaze pierce her back. Leah tried to stay confident, but her heart raced as she walked away without turning around. She didn't know what had alerted her. It could have been a simple test, but there was something in that look, in the tone of his voice, that left a lurking threat. When she finally disappeared around the corner, she was overcome with a vague, heavy feeling, as if this day was just beginning and something unsettling was already waiting for her. The policeman's name was Jackson Marlowe. He had been a police officer in this city for many years, believing himself to be the man who knew everything about its streets and people. But with each passing year, his attitude toward his job changed. What had once been a sincere desire to uphold the law was now increasingly a chore filled with cynicism and frustration. He saw crime in every corner. Suspicion became his constant companion, and the residents of the neighborhood became the ones he had to keep under control. Few of his colleagues knew that Jackson felt an underlying dislike for a certain part of the city's population. He didn't like new families coming into his neighborhood, people who, in his opinion, didn't belong in this part of town. He regarded them with wariness, sometimes with judgment, and was not shy about expressing it in his gaze or in his behavior. It seemed to him that they only made his job harder, that they were always involved in something unclean. One way or another, Jackson was convinced that dark-skinned people often brought trouble with him. And though it was just a prejudice, he didn't realize how deeply it had taken root in his worldview. When he saw Leah at the intersection, he immediately noted her. A young black girl walking through the streets early in the morning had instantly aroused his suspicion. He didn't know her, but already a familiar pattern was unfolding in his mind. She must be the kind of person who was either connected to trouble or would cause trouble in the future. He had no reason to think so, but his view is already clouded by accumulated prejudices, which he justified to himself with years of experience. He saw her not just as a teenager, but as a potential threat, as if her very presence on the streets of the city was a challenge. When Leah stopped at his request and answered his questions, Jackson didn't listen to her words but looked for signs of lies and fear. It seemed to him that any uncertainty in her answers was confirmation of his suspicions. He watched her reactions, trying to catch the slightest glimmer of insincerity. He had already thought she was definitely hiding something. And what is she doing in a neighborhood like this? He thought, holding back his irritation. He didn't like the fact that she was walking down a street where people like her were rarely seen. Her jacket, her manner of speaking, her attempt to walk away under his gaze all reinforced his prejudice. He imagined that perhaps she was involved in a theft, or that she was associated with a group of troublemaking teens. An image was already forming in his head that had nothing to do with the real Leah, but was created by his own stereotypes and biases. They're all the same, he thought, standing next to the car and watching it drive off into the distance. First they're just teenagers, and then they're gangsters. It was a personal conviction, one he never voiced to anyone, but one that invariably influenced his actions and decisions. Not only that, but in the back of his mind, Jackson felt a strange, underlying desire to prove himself right. He convinced himself that people like him had to keep people like Leah under control, that if they didn't, they would undermine the established order. He didn't realize how much his view of the world was distorted by inner barriers and fears. He thought he saw reality more clearly than anyone else, that his suspicions were always justified. For Jackson Marlowe, the day had begun like so many others, but now After his brief encounter with Leah, a plan was already brewing in his mind. He was sure he could prove her guilty, that he would eventually find something compromising about her. In his mind, it was nothing more than a show of vigilance. It didn't even occur to him that his attitude toward Leah had no basis in fact. He believed that experience and intuition told him that she was hiding something dangerous to society. And as Leah walked off into the distance, Jackson sensed that their meeting was just the beginning. Jackson couldn't get Leah out of his mind. Her gaze, her calm tone, and especially the way she tried to walk away under his scrutiny, all of it only made him more suspicious. He decided that the girl was hiding something, and the more he thought about it, the more he felt the urge to bring her out into the open. From his point of view, people like Leah were usually hiding something wrong, which meant she had to be nailed as soon as possible, before she did any more damage. Jackson was sure none of his colleagues would understand that there were no major incidents in their neighborhood, and most police officers simply patrolled the streets without getting into details. But Jackson considered himself a person who looked deeper, a peeler, seeing things in people that others didn't. He thought he was making the streets safer by getting rid of potential threats before they even showed themselves. The next day, patrolling the streets, he spotted Leah again. She was walking the same way she'd gone to school, without attracting any attention. But this time Jackson was prepared. In the trunk of his patrol car was the evidence he decided to use if the situation permitted. They were small items taken last week from the pockets of the real culprit: a purse with change, a pair of stolen earrings, small trinkets that usually attracted the attention of teenagers. When he saw Leah, he immediately had a plan. He parked the car a little farther down the street and got out without drawing attention to himself. Then he quickly headed into the alley that her path to school crossed and put his wallet and earrings in the shadows behind the trash cans, hoping that someone else wouldn't notice. As soon as Leah came closer, he pretended as if he had accidentally noticed her and immediately called out. "Are you here again?" he said, taking a few steps toward her. His voice had the unmistakable distaste that Leah had sensed the last time she'd been here. "I'm going to school, just like yesterday," she answered with a little confusion. She couldn't understand why he was paying attention to her again. She could see the confusion on her face, but Jackson saw it as an attempt to hide her guilt. "You know there's been a wave of petty thefts in the city?" he asked with feigned seriousness, tilting his head to the side as if gauging her reaction. "It's quite possible you know something about it, isn't it?" Leah felt a chill go through her. She couldn't believe the policeman was accusing her of stealing. Her words stuck in her throat, and she shook her head in confusion. "I didn't do anything like that. I'm just going to school," she answered quietly, feeling anxiety overwhelm her. "Really? How about you come with me? We found something suspicious nearby, and I think you know about it." His voice sounded menacingly calm, as if he knew he'd find proof of her guilt. He gestured for her to follow him, and Leah, feeling trapped, obeyed. She didn't understand why, but the policeman insisted, and she decided to go, not yet knowing that he'd already set it up. Jackson led her to the alley where the items he had hidden lay. He quickly popped the lid of the trash can and pointed to the wallet and earrings lying in the shadows. "And how did it end up here?" he asked with a wry grin, taking a step back and crossing his arms over his chest. "Come on, explain to me what it is." Leah looked at the find with amazement. She had no idea where the things had come from, but the policeman was looking at her as if everything had been resolved. She noticed his wary gaze, as if he was waiting for her to confess. I don't know. This is the first time I've ever seen it," she said quietly, feeling panic overwhelm her. "Seeing it for the first time, you say?" Jackson feigned doubt. "That's odd. Very strange that you walk through here every day and suddenly there are stolen items here. Do you really want me to believe that?" Leah tried to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. The situation was getting worse, and she realized that they wouldn't believe her. Jackson stared intently at Leah without averting his gaze, and with every word she said, his confidence that he was in complete control of the situation only grew. He saw the way her eyes raced, the tenseness in her shoulders and arms, and decided it was a sign of fear and guilt. Even though Leah was simply frightened by his tone and accusations, this was the perfect opportunity for him to push her into a confession. "All right, let's see what else we've got here," he said, his voice torn between indifference and menace with deliberate carelessness. Jackson took out of his pocket the plastic bag he had secretly brought with him on patrol. It contained change, a couple coins, and an old key that had long ago been recovered from another theft. And Jackson knew it was unlikely that anyone would be looking for that particular item. It was his evidence bag, a kit he used to add the right details to a case when he thought he needed to. He walked over to the trash cans, pretending as if he was noticing the bag for the first time, and slowly picked it up, turning it so that Leah could see its contents. "Do you know what it is?" he asked in a sarcastic tone, seeing her flounder in surprise. Leah just shook her head, watching his movements with a puzzled look. "That's very strange. There's the purse, the earrings, and now the key. Don't you have anything to say?" he continued, pushing harder with each word. "Maybe it's time you stop playing innocent. If you confess now, it'll be a lot easier." She stood before him with a feeling of utter powerlessness. She knew she had never seen these things before, much less taken them, but her words and protests seemed to have no power against the expression on his face, full of certainty of her guilt. I don't know where it came from. Really?" Leah tried to remain calm, but her voice betrayed a growing panic. She knew that something was going wrong, that her words weren't getting through to him, and she was beginning to realize that she was trapped in a trap that wasn't easy to get out of. "You don't know, you say?" Jackson raised an eyebrow, pretending to listen, but he'd already made up his mind. "Well, then, it'll be recorded in the report as fact," and the evidence spoke for itself. He pretended to make a note in his notebook, pulled out his walkie-talkie, and said something briefly to his colleagues, saying he'd found the suspect. Leah felt herself getting dizzy. Her heart thudded in her chest as she desperately tried to figure out what to do next. No one had told her how to behave in this situation, and now her every protest was just another confirmation of her guilt. "You need to come with me to the station," Jackson said, putting a hand on her shoulder so that no one would notice the latent strength in his grip. "We'll figure out who you are and what you were doing near those things." She realized that protesting was pointless. She was being led like a criminal, and there was nothing she could do about it. She was already guilty in his eyes, and his power gave him the opportunity to make her look like the delinquent she had never been. As Jackson took her firmly by the shoulder and steered her toward the patrol car, Leah felt her breathing become ragged and her heart beat so loud that it seemed to overpower the noise of the street. She couldn't fathom that this was happening to her up until that moment. Her life had been filled with the normal cares and joys of a teenager, and now a policeman, the man she'd always trusted as her protector, was pulling her into a squad car as if she were a dangerous criminal. She tried to stop, to delay her step, hoping that perhaps her words, or at least the look of desperation on her face, would help him realize his mistake. "Please, I didn't do anything. I swear, I don't even know where these things came from." Her voice shook, and she felt tears coming to her eyes. But Jackson paid no attention to that. He only squeezed her shoulder lightly, tightening his grip as if her pleas were just noise he was used to ignoring. Panic began to rise, like a wave washing over her head. She tried to breathe deeply, but fear clenched her chest, preventing her from taking a full breath. Her feet felt like they were stuck to the ground, and she struggled to push herself forward. People were walking around them, glimpsing what was happening, but no one stopped. No one asked questions. Her scream caught in her throat. She wanted to scream for someone to stop, for someone to help her, but she realized she was afraid of provoking more anger in the policeman who was already holding her like a criminal. When they reached the car, he opened the door and gave her a little push inside. Leah collapsed into the seat, feeling like a bird in a cage. She stared at his face, hoping for the slightest doubt, even a glimmer of compassion, but there was only cold indifference in his eyes, as if she were just another case he had to close. Jackson got behind the wheel, and they drove off. Leah stared at the road in front of her, desperately wondering what to do next. She tried to reassure herself, tried to remind herself that she was innocent, that the truth was on her side, but each time she faced the merciless reality that her words, her assurances of innocence, meant nothing in the face of the police badge and the power he had over her. The world outside the car windows seemed unreal. Familiar streets passed by, passers-by walked by, unaware of what was going on inside the car. Leah thought about how her family would look for her, how worried they would be when she didn't come home. Her mother, her grandmother, they'd always been there for her, always telling her that the truth would always win out, that the law protected the innocent. But now she realized that it was all crumbling before her, and no one could save her. Her hands were shaking, and she couldn't stop thinking about how to prove her innocence. Thoughts flashed randomly through her mind. She imagined being interrogated, imagining someone looking at her with the same cold distrust as Jackson. She realized that at that moment, she was just a suspect to him and to the system, and she wasn't being given a chance to prove that she had nothing to do with it. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks, and she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to find some support, but the fear swallowed her whole, leaving only emptiness and despair. The small surveillance camera, mounted on the corner of a building directly across from the very alley where Jackson had supposedly discovered the evidence, did not attract much attention. It was covered in a layer of city dust, almost invisible, hardly noticeable among the facades of buildings and store awnings. The camera had long been a part of the cityscape, as familiar as lampposts or road signs. It was installed a few years ago, when thefts in the neighborhood increased, and it worked daily, recording the flow of people, cars, and the rare events that occur on the seemingly quiet streets. Leah and Jackson knew nothing about her. It was like she was invisible to them. And when Jackson stopped Leah in that very alley and discovered the things he planted, the camera carefully recorded everything, not missing a single moment. Its lens, carefully aimed at the sidewalk in the alley, recorded not only the usual city traffic, but also the fact that Jackson had approached the trash cans long before Leah had arrived. The morning before, the camera had captured him getting out of his car and taking a leisurely look around the street, making sure there were no bystanders or passers-by nearby. The camera caught him opening the trunk, taking out a bag of change, earrings and an old key, turning around several times as if checking to make sure no one had noticed him. In the recording, you could clearly see him walk over to the trash cans with a cold, calm face, as if it were something familiar, and hide the items under the lid, hoping that his evidence would remain there unnoticed until the next morning. When Jackson returned to his car, the camera captured that, too. Everything was filmed, every little manipulation, every step, as if someone were watching him invisibly. The camera silently recorded the truth, not interfering, not judging, just recording the facts. The next day, when Jackson pulled Leah over, the camera came back on, capturing their interaction. It recorded him stopping her at the intersection, with a cold expression on his face, as if he'd been preparing for this moment for a long time. He walked beside her, at ease but with a shadow of wariness, like a deft hunter leading his prey into a prearranged trap. Every move Jackson made, every word he said to accuse Leah, was recorded with frightening precision. The camera caught Leah's confused face, her look of fear and incomprehension, her attempts to explain herself, her barely audible words of protest that were drowned in his cold accusations. She tried to fight, but every gesture, every desperate look, was only a reminder of her defenselessness against the power Jackson represented. On the tape, you could see Leah recoil when he showed her the found items. She stared at them, unable to understand how they could have been there. Her eyes were panicked, her hands were trembling, and the camera clearly captured this storm of emotions, a mixture of fear, surprise, and bewilderment as she tried to realize how it was that she was being accused of something she had not done. Jackson was too confident and focused on his trap to pay attention to the camera. For him, it was a familiar game, a script in which he knew every line by heart. He didn't even realize that someone was watching his actions, that all of it, his words and gestures, were recorded with frightening precision. He forgot that there were cameras on that street. He didn't even think that someone might someday review the tape and see the truth behind his pretended accusations. When Jackson and Leah left, the patrol car disappeared into the flow of city traffic, leaving behind an empty street and an invisible witness, a camera that continued to work quietly, recording everything that was happening around it. This camera was indifferent to what was happening. Its lens kept every detail, every gesture, every fleeting shadow of suspicion, remaining indifferent to everything it saw. And even as the alleyway emptied and the sun slowly moved across the sky, the camera continued to stand guard, preserving all the recorded truth that could, at the right moment, become Leah's voice, her last hope, her salvation. A few days later, when Leah had given up hope and was sure that the whole world was against her, an invisible witness, a surveillance camera, finally got a chance to reveal the truth. There was a clatter of keys in the police station, a routine review of the city's camera footage. Usually it was part of a standard procedure that few people gave much thought to, but today something caught the attention of the young detective. Oh, watching footage from the neighborhood, caught a glimpse of the strange behavior of the cop in the alley. On the screen before him was a scene that shocked him more and more with each passing second. The black and white image showed Jackson Marlowe, a stern and experienced officer whom he had always thought of as conscientious. But what was happening on the screen was a far cry from integrity. The camera clearly and inexorably recorded Marlowe looking around, opening the trunk of his patrol car and pulling out a small plastic bag of other people's belongings. The tape clearly showed Jackson walking with a steady stride toward the trash cans without looking back, dropping the bag of evidence with a cold and businesslike grip where he would later find it in Leah's presence. He did it as calmly as if he were repeating a learned action, dropping the items. He checked again to make sure he was out of sight and walked back to the car with an expression of absolute confidence on his face. He was calm, almost relaxed. No one, he thought, could have found out about his little ruse. The detective, seeing this, felt a chill go through him. He rewound the tape and watched the moment again, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. But the image remained unchanged. Marlowe put the evidence in the alley and then calmly walked away as if nothing had happened. Every movement was recorded with unmistakable clarity. The camera was filmed from such an angle that there was no doubt that he had done it, and that it was his fault that the evidence had appeared there. The recording continued, and soon Leah appeared on the screen, walking the same route, unsuspecting, with her bag on her shoulder and a pensive look on her face. The camera showed Jackson suddenly getting out of his car and walking toward her with a predatory, heavy stride. He called out to her, and she stopped, a little confused, looking at him with bewilderment and alarm. The detective watched with a pang in his heart as Jackson confidently led Leah to where that evidence was hidden. The footage showed a recoil when she saw the earrings and purse, looking at them with horror and confusion, as if she didn't understand how they could be there. Her face, full of panic and fear, reflected the full range of emotions, from utter incomprehension to despair, as she tried to explain to Jackson that she knew nothing about it. The camera caught every detail. It caught Leah mumbling words of justification, desperate to prove that she had nothing to do with those things. She stood before Jackson, frightened and helpless, but he continued to accuse her, his voice cold and his expression stern. He didn't even try to listen to her. It had all been decided for him beforehand. His every movement, his every look, had been recorded, and now, looking at the screen, the detective realized that he had found not just evidence, but proof of a monstrous injustice. The camera captured the moment of the frame-up so clearly that there was no doubt he was a true witness to the way Jackson had deliberately accused an innocent man, to the way he had used his power to ruin a young girl's life simply because he thought she was a convenient target for his bias. With every minute of watching, the detective's sense of outrage grew inside. He realized he was looking at evidence that could save Leah and finally stop Jackson. Detective Alexei Garcia Saturday in the darkened records room. Holding his breath, he scrolled through the video over and over, every detail before his eyes clear and undeniable. He knew Jackson Marlowe knew him as a respected officer, a senior officer who never hesitated to make decisions on patrol. But what he was seeing now overturned all his perceptions. At first, Alexei didn't believe that Jackson had really set the girl up. He tried to find some explanation, perhaps an unusual arrest tactic or a coincidence. But with each passing minute, his doubts grew less and less. The tape spoke for itself, and there was no doubt that Marlowe had planned the setup in advance. Alexei was still new to the department and realized that an accusation against such inexperienced and respected officers as Jackson could turn into not just a scandal, but the destruction of his own career. But he couldn't watch the video and remain silent. A sense of justice was growing in him, anger at the realization that Leah, an ordinary girl, had been dragged into this nightmare by someone who should have been protecting her rights, not violating them. Alexei left the dark room and headed for the office of his immediate superior, Lieutenant Kelly Rain. Kelly was a strict but fair person, respected for her open mind and ability to make tough decisions. Alexei knew that if anyone could see the truth in this situation, it would be her. When he knocked on the door and entered, Kelly looked up from the stack of papers and frowned when she saw his concerned face. "Something urgent, Garcia?" she asked, sensing at once that his agitation was not just the usual fatigue of routine. "Yes, Lieutenant, we have a problem," he began, trying to find the words. I just came across a surveillance tape. It concerns the recent arrest of a young woman on suspicion of theft. Kelly set aside her pen and looked at him carefully. What exactly did you see? Marlowe, he said, almost in a whisper, as if even the thought was hard to bear. He planted the evidence. The tape shows him hiding things in the alley beforehand, and then calling the girl to the place and accusing her of stealing. It's all on the tape. He planned it. Lieutenant Rain was silent for a few seconds, obviously trying to comprehend what she had heard. Alexei's words sounded incredible. She had known Jackson Marlowe for many years and thought him a man of strict principles, but something in Alexei's eyes, in his insistence, in his tension, convinced her that he was telling the truth. Show me the tape, she said quietly, realizing this could be one of the hardest decisions of her career. Alexei led her into the viewing room and turned on the tape. They both sat there in complete silence, staring at the screen. First Jackson, calmly opening the trunk, then his confident movements as he hid the bag of belongings behind the trash cans, and his cold, indifferent stare as he led Leah to the place, her frightened face full of confusion and fear. It was all unfolding before them like a scene from a bad movie. Kelly sat there motionless, her face stony, but Alexei saw the expression in her eyes change. She felt the same mixture of rage and disgust that he had felt minutes earlier. In that moment, everything they knew about Jackson, his years of service, his reputation, didn't matter. What mattered was the truth that the camera had silently recorded. This is outrageous, she said at last, her voice cold but with a restrained fury. We can't let it go without consequences. The girl is innocent. We must do everything we can to exonerate her and drop the charges against her. Alexei nodded, relieved that Kelly was willing to fight for justice, even if it meant going up against one of her own. He saw the first ray of hope in her determined gaze, the hope that the truth on the record would finally be heard. Kelly and Alexei decided to act immediately. They realized that every minute could be worth its weight in gold. If Jackson found out that the tape had gotten to their superiors, he would do everything he could to cover his tracks. Kelly took personal control of the tape and ordered Alexei not to tell anyone about it until an official investigation was underway. But rumors spread quickly, especially when it comes to police officers. Jackson was summoned to Kelly's office the next day, and when he entered, his face changed immediately as Lieutenant Rain and Detective Garcia sat in front of the monitor, where a frame of footage the exact moment where he puts the evidence behind the trash cans was paused. His face turned stony, but his eyes tensed, betraying anxiety. He quickly assessed the situation and realized that they knew more than he expected. Marlowe, Kelly began, we need to discuss your actions in the case of Leah Morgan. Lieutenant, I follow protocol, he replied dryly, though there was a hint of alarm in his voice. She's a suspect, and all the evidence points to her. Alexei couldn't stand it. Evidence you planted yourself. Jackson, the camera caught it all. You put her there on purpose, knowing she didn't do anything. Jackson grinned, folding his arms across his chest, his eyes glittering with coldness and stubbornness. Hey camera, are you really going to believe that garbage? He threw, trying to keep his tone high. Some murky footage can't be proof, and this girl is no angel. We know what they are. Kelly frowned, catching in his words the familiar tinge of contempt with which he spoke of some of the neighborhood's residents. Jackson had always been suspicious of them, especially the young blacks, believing that most of them were connected to crime in one way or another. But now that prejudice was clearly surfacing, Kelly felt even more disgusted. Jackson, you're out of line, she said quietly but firmly. This is not your personal trial. This is about justice, not your prejudices. Jackson realized that his usual arrogance wasn't going to work. He quickly changed tactics, his face softening and his voice becoming almost conciliatory. Look, Kelly, I know how this looks, he began, as if to justify himself, but we know how these guys get away with it. This tape was just an unfortunate coincidence. Believe me, you're not going to let some girl ruin my career because of a technical glitch, are you? But Kelly wasn't about to back down. Alexei could see her holding back her anger. She was well aware that Jackson would use any means possible to avoid responsibility. After Jackson left the office, dejected but clearly not intending to give up, he immediately sprang into action. He knew several officers whom he trusted and who shared his views on keeping order in the city. He found one of them his old friend and colleague Frank Madden, with whom they had worked together on patrols many years ago. Frank had always been supportive of Jackson, and he knew that Frank would probably side with him. if he presented the situation as a misunderstanding. "Frank, I need your help," Jackson said at the bar where they met late that night. "It's just a misunderstanding, but someone decided to make a fuss over this girl." Frank listened to him, nodding and inserting remarks that only served to reinforce Jackson's conviction that his actions were justified. Frank himself had often expressed his own dislike of black people, believing them to be a source of trouble. They both discussed it with a touch of contempt and cynicism that usually remained hidden in plain sight, but was on full display within these walls. "Come on, Jackson, you just did your job. These activists are always looking for a reason to blame us." "It's okay, I've got your back," Frank assured me. Jackson could feel a sense of schadenfreude growing inside him. He was going to do everything he could to undermine faith in the tape. With the help of his friends, he began spreading rumors that the camera was unreliable, that its footage might have been tampered with, and found a technician who, for a fee, agreed to lose some of the files, allegedly by mistake. But Alexei and Kelly knew that Jackson would try to distort the truth. They carefully guarded the original recordings, making several backups. Kelly alerted her superiors that the case required special attention and protection, so that the records wouldn't be lost or tampered with. She also began gathering additional evidence of Jackson's bias by interviewing coworkers and neighbors who noticed his discriminatory views. Each day the tension increased. Jackson realized that his game was getting dangerous, but he was sure the system would protect him. He was his own man, and he knew that many in the department thought his methods were acceptable for the common good. But Kelly wasn't going to back down, and Alexei, who saw the truth on the tape, was also ready to see it through. Jackson felt the ground slipping from under his feet. Even so, he wasn't going to admit his guilt. He would do anything to avoid responsibility. The next day, the police department began an internal investigation that focused not only on Jackson's actions, but on the entire system that allowed abuses of power and prejudice against black residents of the neighborhood. For a department accustomed to strict chain of command and secrecy, the news that a senior officers might have deliberately framed an innocent man came as a shock. People were whispering, discussing the situation, but one thing was clear. Now everyone was waiting for the results that would decide the fate not only of Leah, but of Jackson Marlowe himself. Kelly and Alexei took the initiative to conduct an in-depth analysis of the records in order to expose not only Jackson's actions, but possibly other officers who shared his views and were involved in creating a system that allowed for such setups. A special team of detectives was assigned to the investigation and tasked with scrutinizing all records related to Leah's case, as well as reviewing cases in which Jackson was involved to identify patterns and possible biased actions. Kelly gathered the team in the control conference room. The long table was lined with case files from every case Jackson had ever handled. Some of them had been closed years ago, and now, leafing through the reports and records, the detectives couldn't hide their surprise. Most of the cases followed the same pattern. The people Jackson had apprehended were often black or from other minorities. The reports were filled with accusations that were hard to prove, and in some cases, the evidence appeared so unexpectedly that the detectives now seriously wondered if it had been fabricated. Alexei, sitting in front of the monitor with a recording, replayed over and over again the moments where Jackson had planted the evidence behind the trash cans, and then returned to the car with an expression of complete calm. On the tape, his face reflected an almost maniacal certainty that he was right, as if he saw this act as justification for his experience and premonition. The camera even captured his gaze, cold and evaluating, which he cast at Leah as if he already knew her fate, like a judge who had already passed judgment. "Look here," Alexei drew his colleague's attention, pointing to the moment in the tape where Jackson was checking to see if anyone could see him. He was acting cautiously, as if he knew he was breaking the rules. He's literally looking around, making sure no one sees him. Kelly and the other detectives watched the tape carefully, and as more and more evidence of Jackson came before their eyes, the atmosphere grew more tense. The cops, many of whom had worked with him for years, now felt that the trust they had once had in this man was crumbling right before their eyes. On the screen before them was a picture of an immoral act that violated the very essence of what it means to be a defender of the law. At the same time, The investigation was becoming a personal challenge for each detective, especially for those who were younger and still believed in the fairness of the system. They realized that if they let it go without consequences, if they didn't uncover the whole truth, each of them would be complicit in this violation of the law, and Leah would be just one of many victims. Kelly insisted on scrutinizing Jackson's actions over the past few years and gathering as much testimony as possible from those who had ever crossed paths with him during the investigations. In the process of analyzing the recordings, several junior officers came up with concerns they had previously hesitated to express aloud. One of them, a young patrolman named Ricardo, told Kelly about odd remarks Jackson uttered on duty. Ricardo recalled how Jackson often talked about the problems of the neighborhood and complained about the outsiders, whom he contemptuously referred to as nothing but city trash. Jackson was convinced that blacks and other unreliables were the main cause of the city's troubles. Ricardo admitted reluctantly. He repeatedly said that the only way to bring order here was with a firm hand, and if someone didn't like it, that was their problem. By collecting such evidence, Kelly and her team of detectives began to see the full picture. Jackson had long lived in a system of prejudice, and his hatred for the black residents of the neighborhood had gradually grown to such proportions that he no longer saw anything wrong in his actions. He saw himself as a gatekeeper who decided that the law was his tool to use as a saw feed. But this time the system had cracked. The tape that became their main evidence contained all the necessary elements: the deliberate frame-up, Jackson's contemptuous attitude toward Leah, and his manipulation of the evidence. Every frame served as undeniable proof that he had deliberately fabricated the case based on his internal bias. The last step left was to gather the materials and prepare a formal report to be submitted to the city court and the prosecutor's office. But Kelly realized that once it got outside their department, the consequences could be devastating. Jackson wasn't just a rank-and-file officer. His connections within the police department and among local officials could obstruct justice. He'd already started putting pressure on his contacts, and Kelly knew that once the investigation became public, Jackson would use every leverage he could to soften the blow or turn the tables. "We have to be prepared for this case to be a high-profile case," Kelly told her team at the final meeting. "We are stepping in to fight not only for justice for Leah, but also to show that such actions will not go unpunished." They knew they had a difficult road ahead of them, but now they had the truth on record, a truth that Jackson could no longer simply destroy or hide. Shortly after the internal investigation was completed, Kelly and her team presented the evidence they had gathered at a meeting at the police department attended by representatives of the prosecutor's office and the city administration. The case, seemingly insignificant at first, uncovered a rot that many knew about but that no one dared to expose. The facts were laid on the table in no uncertain terms. Jackson Marlowe had abused his power by framing an innocent girl because of his personal biases. Every frame from the court V camera was indisputable evidence of a frame-up, cold-bloodedly planned, and cynically executed. The meeting lasted several hours. Some participants in the meeting demanded an investigation into Jackson's entire employment, while others expressed concern about how the case could damage the reputation of the police force in the eyes of the citizens. It was obvious to Kelly that they were trying to drag the case out, delaying its review under the pretext of possible negative consequences for the department. But, armed with the support of Alexei and the detective team, she was determined to keep the case alive. Kelly insisted on meeting with the district attorney to get immediate action to drop the charges against Leah Morgan. The district attorney, Jennifer Morris, was inexperienced and strict woman, accustomed to pursuing the truth and enforcing the law, but it was important to her that procedural rules be followed, especially in a case involving a police officers. Nevertheless, after reviewing the tape and analyzing the report, Prosecutor Morris recognized that the evidence against Leah had been fabricated and agreed to help Kelly get justice. The next morning, Leah was summoned to the prosecutor's office. She sat her day in the waiting room, nervous and fearing the worst. Over the past few days, her life had been turned upside down. She was afraid to go out on the street, and many people looked at her with distrust, as if she were a suspect in a theft. Her whole world had collapsed, and she had no idea how to find peace again. But when Attorney Morris and Kelly entered the room, their faces were determined and confident. "Leah," Morris began softly, We have news that will make a difference. We want to apologize to you for everything that happened. It wasn't your fault. We now have enough evidence to clear you of all charges and clear your name." Leah stared at the prosecutor, not believing her ears. Her eyes widened, and for a second there was a hope in them that she was afraid of losing. She wanted to ask again, to clarify, to hear those words again, to believe them. "Is that true? Are you saying that I'm free?" she asked with a tremor in her voice. "Yes," Kelly replied, walking over to her. "We have gathered all the evidence that proves your innocence. We intend to drop all charges and clear your name with the city." Leah closed her eyes, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. These words were the ray of light she had been waiting for. The hope she had thought had faded. She didn't know how to thank these people who hadn't abandoned her and had gotten her to the truth. Prosecutor Morris understood that this case could not simply remain on the record. It was a case that affected not only the fate of one girl, but also the public's trust in justice and in the police force itself. After the charges against Leah had been dropped, the prosecutor had initiated a press conference at which Kelly and Alexa had joined her. They knew that this was a risky move and would cause mixed reactions, but to hide what had happened would have betrayed the principles of justice. When Leah first heard about the press conference, she was confused and afraid. She was unprepared to be the face of a high-profile case, fearing public scrutiny and possible judgment. But Kelly supported her, explaining that it was not only an important step toward restoring her reputation, but also a signal to the entire city that the police were willing to take responsibility for mistakes and right wrongs. Alexei and Kelly's support helped Leah make up her mind. At the press conference, the room was filled with reporters, cameras, and microphones. Prosecutor Morris began her statement. "We are here to bring the city some important news. We recently uncovered an abuse of power by police officers. Officer Jackson Marlowe was unfortunately found to be biased and using his position to trump up charges against Leah Morgan, a young girl innocent of what she was accused of. Thanks to a surveillance camera and honest police officers, we were able to uncover the truth." The reporters were silent, recording every word. The prosecutor described how an internal investigation had been conducted, how a team of detectives led by Lieutenant Rain and Detective Garcia had gathered evidence that completely exonerated Leah. It was announced that all charges were dropped and a new investigation was launched to see if Jackson Marlowe had committed similar acts before. When Leah rose to say a few words, her voice was shaky, but there was strength in it. She recounted her experience, the fear and humiliation she had endured. She explained that she hoped her case would serve as an example to others who had faced injustice. "I am grateful to those who believed me and fought for the truth. Thank you for not letting me become another victim. I hope it never happens to anyone else," she finished, looking out into the hall full of people and feeling that she had finally found her voice. The news of the unjust accusation and the intervention of honest police officers shook the community. Many citizens, upon learning of the events, expressed support for Leah and approval of the actions of the prosecutor's office and honest officers. Community organizations began to emerge, calling for reforms and greater control over abuses within the police force. In those days, Leah suddenly found herself surrounded by support and attention from people who had not noticed her before. She received letters and phone calls from friends and acquaintances trying to encourage her. Even her teachers and classmates, from whom she had stayed away, began to support her after learning the truth. Her reputation was restored, but most importantly, she gained confidence and realized that her voice and her story mattered. Meanwhile, the prosecutor's office continued to investigate Jackson Marlowe. Other cases were uncovered in which he had abused his authority, acting against people whose only crime was that they did not feed his preconceived notions. He was indicted and a trial began that became a showcase. No one, not even a police officers with years of experience, can use his authority to harm innocent people. For Leah, it was the end of a difficult period that, despite her suffering, had taught her strength and resilience. She became an example for others and a symbol that even one voice, determination and truth can win if there are people willing to fight for justice. Every lost night, every humiliation she had experienced had been reversed. She now knew that her story had brought change, and it gave her the strength that would be with her for the rest of her life. Jackson Marlowe, accustomed to the role of an experienced and respected police officer, found himself in a position for which he was completely unprepared. His world literally collapsed when formal accusations began to be made against him. Colleagues who had previously nodded at him in respect now avoided his gaze, and his superiors kept their distance. Realizing that the scandal was getting serious, he could feel the ground eroding beneath his feet, but he wasn't about to give up yet. The first accusation of abuse of power and fabrication of evidence came to him in his work mail. He read dry lines of legal language that threatened to destroy everything he had ever built. It seemed that the very system he had thought of as his tool was now turning against him. Jackson tried to suppress a flash of panic, convincing himself that this was only a temporary misunderstanding and he could work it out, as he had done before. But now the stakes were higher. Prosecutor Morris, detectives led by Kelly Rain, journalists, city activists all focused on getting the truth out. And this time, he was sure he couldn't handle all these forces working against him. Jackson gathered his thoughts and decided that the best strategy was to categorically deny everything. He realized that if he admitted even the slightest guilt, the consequences would be irreparable. So he insisted at all meetings and interrogations that he had acted solely according to the law, and that the accusations were nothing more than a political game and a witch hunt. "I was doing my job, like I always do," he said when he was called in for questioning by Internal Affairs. "This town is full of people who think they can do anything. I was only trying to protect order and safety." His voice shook with tension, but he held himself back, hoping his determination would impress the investigators across from him. However, Saturday, Alexei Garcia, the man who had seen the tape with his own eyes and knew how Jackson lied, Alexei remained silent, just staring at Jackson, letting him dig his own hole. Each of Jackson's arguments seemed weaker than the last. With each minute of the interrogation, he felt his usual confidence dissipate and the tension build, like a tight noose gradually tightening around his neck. Finding himself cornered, Jackson decided to use the last connections he could count on. He knew several influential people in the police force and even the mayor's office, with whom he was connected through years of service and a general dislike of those they considered dangerous elements. He knew that bias was firmly woven into the system in this city, and figured he could convince them to help him cover up the evidence, or at least mitigate the consequences. He called an old acquaintance, Captain Frank Madden, who was known for his rigid methods and had similar views to Jackson on keeping order. The meeting was held in an abandoned restaurant on the outskirts of town. Away from prying eyes, Jackson explained to Frank that he was being unfairly accused, that it was a conspiracy against him, and that he was simply doing his duty to the community. Frank, having listened to Jackson with cold determination, shook his head. "Look, Marlowe, you're in trouble, and I'm not gonna get involved if what they're saying is true. You know what you do when you set people up, but there's too much evidence against you right now. Do you realize what this smells like?" Jackson felt his muscles tense. Frank, his last ally, was looking at him with the look of a man who had already made up his mind not to interface. "Are you betraying me, Frank? We've had each other's backs for so many years, and you're leaving me?" Frank spread his arms, showing that his hands were bound. His cold expression told Jackson more than words could say. He was now alone in this nightmare. When Jackson realized there was no support, he became more aggressive. He hired a lawyer known for his hard-nosed methods and aggressive defense tactics. Jackson claimed that he was being accused for racial and political reasons, trying to shift attention from his own actions to fighting pervasive crime in the community. He was not shy about accusing Kelly Rain and Alexis Garcia of personal animosity, claiming they were biased because of his integrity and toughness on the job. But even his lawyer realized the case was futile. Each time Jackson argued that the tape was falsified or taken out of context, Prosecutor Morris presented new evidence of his guilt. Witness testimony, recorded racist remarks, reports from similar cases he had prosecuted before, all added up to a picture of years of abuse of power, and his arrogance and bias were now obvious to all. In one of the interrogations, Jackson suddenly erupted. "It's all a setup. You, all these activists and corrupt journalists, you're just trying to ruin my career. They deserve it, all these victims. All they know is how to disrupt order." These words only confirmed his reputation as a man driven by hatred, prejudice, and contempt for those he was supposed to protect. He had become an unwilling prisoner of his beliefs, not realizing that those beliefs were now working against him. Jackson tried his best to hold on, but everything was crumbling around him. Several charges were brought against him, including abuse of office, tampering with evidence, slander, and discrimination. When the case was reported by journalists, it was publicized, and each new report destroyed his reputation even more. People who had once seen him as a hero now saw him as a man who had abused his power. His house was picketed by protesters demanding justice, and he received threatening letters every day. He was afraid to go out on the street of fear and anger he had once sowed among those he accused was now being unleashed on him. With each new day, Jackson realized there was no way out. The system he had used to his own advantage was now working against him. By taking on Leah's case, the city had shown that it was ready to fight those who hid behind a badge and manipulated the law. The day the charges against Leah Morgan were finally dropped, the city seemed to come alive. Her story, initially covered only by brief headlines, had now become a symbol of the fight against the injustice and bias that permeated the system. Leah had been through a lot of humiliation and fear, but today, finally, she could return to a normal life, a life that had been tried to be taken away from her. After all legal procedures were completed, Attorney Morris organized a public statement to explain to the city how what had happened led to Leah's release and to an investigation that exposed systemic problems. Many people gathered downtown, not only journalists and reporters, but also those who saw in Leah their sister, their daughter, their friend, someone's beloved and innocent soul against whom an unjust attack had been launched. As she stepped onto the stage in front of the crowd, Leah felt her heart clench. She was afraid of the cameras, of the people, of their stares, which until recently had been full of distrust. But standing beside her were people who believed in her and helped her through it all. Kelly Rain and Alexa Garcia were on either side of her, like trusted guards who protected her when it seemed no one believed she was right. We are here today to restore Leah's good name and give her a chance to be who she was again. Prosecutor Morris began, looking out over the crowd. We must recognize that because of one man's bias, this innocent girl was the victim of injustice. But thanks to the support of the community, thanks to honest police officers and honest people, the truth has prevailed. All charges against Leah Morgan have been dropped, and her name is now cleared of any suspicion. There was relief and pride on the faces of the people in the crowd. Leah could not hold back her tears as she saw many people applauding and shouting words of encouragement. Her story, which had become a tale of resistance to injustice, had inspired many, and now she felt like a symbol of strength, endurance, and truth rather than a lone victim. After the charges were officially dropped and her name cleared, Leah was invited to the school to meet with teachers and students. She was anxious about this visit, fearing that her reputation would still remain under the shadow of the charges. But the school arranged a meeting for her, where the principal openly apologized to Leah in the presence of teachers and students, noting that what happened to her was a lesson for each of them. He emphasized that support and trust in people, especially in difficult times, should be above any prejudice and suspicion. Her classmates, some of whom had previously looked at her with distrust, now extended their hands to her, congratulating her, saying they were sorry for what had happened and that they were glad the truth had finally prevailed. Not only was her reputation restored, but now Leah felt that she was seen as a strong person who had been through the ordeal and stood up to it. At the meeting with her friends, Leah finally felt free, as if the heavy weight she had been carrying on her shoulders had dissolved. Many people supported her, even though she hardly knew. Some of the girls from high school told her how her story had given them confidence and reminded them to believe in themselves despite any difficulties. Leah didn't feel like a stranger now, as she had during those troubling days. She was accepted, she was supported, she was restored in her own eyes. The urban community also rallied around Leah. City activists who advocated for justice and civil rights used her story as an example to improve the justice system and increase police accountability to residents. Leah was approached by others who also felt that their rights had once been violated, and she realized that her life now had new meaning. At a city event, Leah was approached by an elderly woman she had seen in the crowd outside the courthouse. The gray-haired lady gave her a big hug and said, "You've inspired us. Leah, you have reminded us all that it is worth fighting for the truth, even when no one believes it. You are brave, and because of you, "My son, your peers and everyone else can hope for a better future." These words shocked Leah. She saw such gratitude and admiration in the woman's eyes that she didn't know what to say. She realized that her story was no longer just a story of injustice, but an example of the strength she had found in herself and the support that came from the community. When passion subsided a little, Leah returned to her normal life, but now her perception was different. She became part of a movement for justice, for equal rights, and her support enabled activists and urban human rights defenders to push for changes in policing. New programs to combat bias among officers were introduced, and additional controls on abuse of power were put in place. Soon, Leah was invited to speak at a civil rights event. On stage in front of hundreds of people, she spoke about her feelings, the fear she had experienced, the despair that had overwhelmed her, and the support that had helped her to persevere. Her words sounded sincere, and she saw people listening intently, realizing that this story could have happened to any of them. Leah became not just the heroine of a single incident, but a symbol of the change that the community was beginning to demand. She was supported at meetings, at school, in the community, and she realized that her voice now had a power she never expected. Leah Morgan's story made residents rethink trust in the system and the importance of supporting each other. Her name was cleared, and in the eyes of the community, she became more than just a girl who had experienced injustice. She became a voice for those who needed the truth and an example of how the strength of spirit and the support of people can defeat even the most unjust system. Now, every time she remembered her experiences, Leah didn't feel pain. She saw how her story had saved others, how her journey to the truth had inspired many, and it was the best ending to this difficult chapter of her life. With the ordeal behind her, Leah began to realize that her story mattered not only to herself, but to many people around her. Deep down, she felt that her case, as horrible as it was important to a society that seemed to have lost faith in justice. This injustice she suffered opened her and others' eyes to how blind and cruel bias and abuse of power can be. But her story was an example that truth can be restored, even in the most dire circumstances, if people are not afraid to fight for it. Leah remembered the moments when she thought there was no hope, that her words meant nothing. She had seen how the system refused to see the truth, turned a blind eye to Jackson Marlowe's cruel manipulations, and how even those closest to her doubted her innocence. But even in moments like these, there was still a small seed of faith in the truth that she clung to desperately. She realized that truth is not just a concept, but a powerful weapon that can break down walls of prejudice and mistrust. Her case proved that truth can break free if there are those who are willing to fight for it despite fear and pain. Never before had Leah realized that the simple words and actions of others could make such a huge difference. In her darkest moments, when she felt like the whole world was against her, strangers were on her side, ready to support and help her through the nightmare. The support of Kelly and Alexei, the help of lawyers and human rights activists, words of encouragement from her classmates and ordinary citizens, all of this was a real revelation to her. She realized that one person can change a lot of things, but to do so, he or she needs those who believe in him or her, who are ready to lend a shoulder and a hand in moments of despair. Now that her story was known throughout the city, Leah realized that community support was not just a formality, but a living, powerful force. She saw how people rallied around her, how they demanded justice by going to rallies and signing petitions. In her case, many found a reflection of their own fears and hopes, and now they saw that every voice, every action could make a difference. Leah truly felt that her story was a story not only of truth triumphing, but also of the power that lies in unity and solidarity. After the conclusion of her case, many people began to wonder how long such abuses had been hidden from public view. Her case sparked many discussions about the need for police reforms and increased oversight of those in authority. The city began talking about implementing mandatory non-discrimination programs, improving internal services, and increasing oversight of officers' actions. Citizens demanded change, realizing that trust in the system could be lost if it did not protect the rights of every citizen, regardless of color, origin, or social status. These changes, though not instantaneous, made Leah feel that her suffering had not been in vain. She now realized that her case had been a kind of catalyst that had awakened people's desire to change the world around them. She saw that people began to openly discuss topics they had previously preferred to keep silent, and the city government began to act for the benefit of all its residents. Without exception, the experience changed Leah on a deep level. She used to believe in the law as something absolute, unquestionable, but now she knew that the system could be flawed, biased, and even intentionally unfair. She realized that true justice is not just about rules and laws, but about people's ability to fight for the truth when it seems like the whole world is set against them. She learned resilience, learned to find strength within herself when that strength seems to be running out. Leah realized that everyone has to face hardships, and that sometimes truth and justice require great effort and endurance. But her story taught her the most important thing, that you can't give up, even when someone tries to break you. She realized that honesty and faith in one's own principles can withstand any challenge, and that fighting for the truth is a choice that everyone must make again and again, even if it leads to disappointment and pain. Leah gradually became not only a role model, but also a person to whom people came for advice and support. People saw her as a symbol of resilience and justice, and she felt that she now had a certain responsibility to society. Her experience taught her not only to defend herself, but also to help those who face injustice. She volunteered with an organization that helps people in similar situations, spoke at meetings and seminars, sharing her story and reminding everyone that there is strength in truth and unity. She was no longer afraid to talk about her pain, and fears. Her words became a source of inspiration for many who face similar situations and did not know where to turn for help. Her case reminded people that the world is not perfect, but change is possible if each of us is willing to support and fight for the truth. For Leah, justice was no longer an abstract concept. She realized that justice is not just about correcting the system's mistakes, but about people's constant pursuit of truth, which requires perseverance and dedication. She realized that justice does not always come at once, but it must be achieved step by step, with each new case, with each new demand for truth. And this path is not always easy, but it is vital for every person living in society. She now believed that her story would be a reminder to everyone that justice is everyone's business, that it lives in the hearts of people who care about injustice, and that change begins with one voice, one story. Leah has come to epitomize that even in the darkest of circumstances, hope for truth must never fade. When Leah looked back on her experience, she realized that without the only witness the court became, her fate might have turned out differently. This invisible eye, which recorded the truth impartially, was the only thing that helped her prove her innocence. This simple device, whose operation sometimes goes unnoticed, was a key element in a case that could have ruined her life. Leah reflected on how, in today's world, technology is becoming part of our everyday surroundings, and how it can play a key role in establishing the truth. Surveillance cameras, phones, recording devices, all of these are no longer just comfort items, but powerful tools that help protect the rights and freedoms of people in difficult situations. Thanks to a camera installed on a street corner, it was possible not only to recover the truth, but also to bring to justice a man who is trying to use his power for his own benefit. In her case, the camera recorded the events with remarkable precision. It impartially recorded Jackson's every move, his manipulations, his gestures, the tone with which he accused her, his cold and prejudiced attitude. Technology became an advocate for the truth, needing no words or emotion, just a camera on, running non-stop, recording everything that others hadn't seen, and doing so dispassionately and reliably. Leah realized that the camera was not only a tool to prove her innocence, but also a symbol of transparency. In a world where bias and stereotypes can be deadly, technology offers a chance to restore balance, prove a point, and provide objective data that helps you judge not by appearances, not by emotions, but by facts. The footage captured by the camera was silent but weighty. It was irrefutable evidence that needs no interpretation. The camera recorded the truth as it was, without distortion, and that was what helped expose the lies and protect Leah. The very thought that someone could fabricate evidence or distort the truth without being able to verify it made Leah shudder. The cameras had become for her a symbol of honesty and objectivity, which she could no longer imagine as separate from justice. Leah realized that trust in evidence was now inextricably linked to the transparency provided by modern technology. Technology becomes especially important in a biased environment, where human error prevents an objective review of situations. Leah now knew what it was like to be falsely accused when you were opposed by someone in a position of power and confidence in their own infallibility. Technology had made it possible to restore justice by pointing to the truth in ways that words and arguments could not. Leah hoped that cameras and other technology would be used not only to monitor but also to protect the innocent. She had seen how the recording had saved her and realized that stories like this could happen again and again. Because of this case, her town began to discuss how technology could help prevent such abuses of power in the future. City officials began to think about developing a camera system in places where conflict situations were more likely to occur, allowing them to record what was happening for later analysis. Now her city was looking at technology not just as a means of control, but as a powerful tool to protect human rights. Leah also thought about the fact that with technology comes responsibility. Cameras, recordings, tracking devices, all of these could be powerful tools of truth, but also terrible tools in the hands of those who wanted to use them for manipulation. She realized that there needed to be a clear system of control over how and by whom data was used. Without transparency and strict ethical regulation, technology can become not an ally, but an enemy of that individual. In her case, the camera had saved her, but she knew that in other circumstances, such devices could have been used for surveillance, invasion of privacy, and even blackmail. She realized that technology itself is neutral, and it is up to people to decide whether it will serve justice and truth or become a tool in the hands of unscrupulous people. This case showed society how important it is to create strict rules so that technology protects, rather than endangers, those who have been victimized by injustice. Leah's story reminded people that technology can be an ally in the fight for justice, but it must be used responsibly and ethically. Her case showed that sometimes technology is the last chance to prove a point. When all human arguments and words are useless, the surveillance camera was the tool that allowed the truth to break through lies, manipulation, and bias, and this case became a symbol for the city. The people of the city now looked at the cameras differently. They saw them not just as a tool of control, but as protectors, as guards ready to preserve the truth. For many, it was a reminder that truth cannot be destroyed if it is backed by objectivity and impartial testimony. Leah realized that her salvation was made possible by a combination of her inner strength and the objectivity that technology provided. Her case inspired community organizations and human rights advocates to further develop technology in the justice sector. The city began discussing the introduction of programs to educate police and citizens about how to use technology to protect rights and prevent violations. Leah learned that additional cameras will now be installed in key neighborhoods, and rules requiring police officers to wear video recorders to ensure transparency in their actions. For Leah, it was the end of her long journey to justice and a new beginning. She realized that her story had helped not only her, but many others who might have been in her shoes. Technology was now not just a part of her salvation, but a symbol of the change her city was striving for. Leah believed that in the future, cameras, recordings, and data would be used to establish the truth, so that tragedies like this would not happen again. Everything she had experienced had left an indelible mark on her soul, but now she was sure that this mark would help her to become stronger. Thanks to the camera and those who believed in her, Leah found not only freedom, but also a new way of looking at the world, where truth and technology can go hand in hand, protecting the rights of every human being. Friends, thank you for watching this story to the end. We are very interested in your opinion. What do you think about what happened to Leah? Have you or a loved one had an experience in your life where you or a loved one had to face injustice or bias, maybe even racism? Please share your stories in the comments. Your experiences and thoughts are really meaningful to us. And who knows, maybe they will help someone else find the strength to fight for the truth. We appreciate each and every one of you who support our channel. Your engagement, your likes, subscriptions, and comments inspire us to do more stories that remind us of the importance of justice and humanity. If you haven't subscribed yet, be sure to do so and click the bell so you don't miss new episodes. We wish you a good day, and remember, the truth will always find its way.